I'm delighted to now move on to our next two expert speakers. It's a great pleasure to welcome David Regan, Director of Squire Patton Boggs LLP, and Wendy Ramshaw, Inclusion and Diversity Manager for Squire Patton Boggs LLP. And they're going to talk about policy and practice, understanding employer responsibilities in recruiting, retaining, and progressing LGBT staff. So over to you, Wendy and David.
Thank you, Adrian. So thank you very much for inviting myself and David to talk today. This is a great opportunity to share a bit about our perspectives on LGBT plus inclusion, both from the people aspect and also from the legal side as well. So I'm the Inclusion Diversity Manager here at Squire Patton Boggs, and I'll let David introduce himself quickly now as well.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm a director in the Labour and Employment team here at Squire Patton Boggs, so my bit is the slightly drier part of this, which is talking you a little bit through the Equality Act and through grievance procedures, but I will try and make it as painless as possible, I promise.
Thanks, David. Okay, so we'll make a start. So the things that we wanted to cover with you today are around attracting and retaining LGBT plus talent. We're also going to look at this issue around unconscious bias and how do we manage that, and is training the answer? David's going to walk you through how to approach your diversity policy, and also looking at how to manage harassments and grievances as well from that sort of legal standpoint. And then finally, I'm going to wrap us up by looking at what have we learned about lockdown and how to work remotely, and how do these things play into the sort of inclusion debate. Before I start, I thought it'd be quite nice for us to have a little reflection moment about where we think we are on our inclusion journey. And that can be specifically around LGBT+, or it can actually just be generally about our whole sort of approach to diversity and inclusion within our organisations. And what I wanted to share with you was a model. Now, I came across this model, I can't take credit for it, I came across this at another webinar and it just really resonated with me and I loved it and I took it away. And it's really helped me and my organisation to really reflect on how we're progressing and what sort of things are we doing and what does that tell us about the impact that we're having. So as you can see here, you've got two axes. You've got one that relates to that internal culture piece. So are you moving from a lesser to a more inclusive space? And then on the lower axis, you've got the impact that this then has on your organisational objectives. So is it having a low impact or is it having a high impact? And as you progress through those stages, you obviously start to build to that piece where you are systemic. So this is where everyone knows that this is how you do business. It's so embedded, ingrained in where you, in how you operate, that there is no doubt that you are a totally inclusive organisation that has aligned all of its goals and objectives to that end. So as you can see, the compliance-driven starting point is more around policies, and that might just be the place that you're at in terms of looking at getting a diversity policy in place, building those harassment and grievance policies, looking at how that plays out perhaps in some of your other processes within the organisation. Programmatic is when you start to look a little bit more purposefully at launching some programmes that help with this debate. So it could be that you bring in some coaching and mentoring specifically for minority groups. It could be that you have training programs, again, trying to educate and raise awareness. And then also your resource groups are perhaps at this stage really sort of starting to deliver some sort of impact on the organisation as well by sort of moving outside of the internal group and talking more widely perhaps to the organisation. And then inclusive is where you really are starting to build it into your talent management processes. It is fundamental to your approach to recruitment. You have some measures of success to know whether this is actually happening. You're starting to have external impact as well. So you're starting to have impact in your community, and some of the perhaps joint initiatives that you've put in place are starting to now bear fruit as well. And then you're really thinking about how to align it to that business strategy. So perhaps thinking about building it into leadership KPIs, for example, or asking your managers to have this as part of their day-to-day assessments. And then, as I say, systemic is really that kind of utopia. So I've got a quick poll for you. If we could launch that poll, I'd be very interested to see where you think you are on that journey. How are we doing on that poll?
We have 51% completed, so I'll leave it for another moment.
Okay. Okay, so that's great to see. So we've got some people who are, so no one's at the systemic stage yet, which is good because it gives us something to aim towards. It's great to see we've got 19% at the inclusive stage, 44%, so our majority seems to be at the programmatic, and then 38% are at the compliance driven. So, I mean, that's really interesting to see. And I would say that personally, if I'm being completely honest, that probably echoes, I guess, where we are as well. I think that if I was to sort of hand on heart say where I think we are on the journey, I would put us somewhere between programmatic and inclusive. And one of these sort of approaches that we've taken is by doing things like the Stonewall Employer Index. We also completed the Tide benchmarking tool that ENEI run. And that really helped us to understand which areas of the business that perhaps we were further ahead with than others. So I definitely recommend some of those sort of benchmarking tools to help you to get a sense of that. But, you know, we're on the journey, we're on the path, and I think that's the most important thing. Okay, so thank you for taking part in that. It just helps to set the scene. So I'm going to move on to thinking about, sorry, I just can't seem to move my slide on. Great, so you're able to move,
No, I'm afraid it comes from your side, Wendy, but have you got the arrows at the bottom right-hand corner of your keyboard, which might help you?
Yeah, that seems to be completely stuck. Bear with me. Let me see if I can just move on manually. Let's try that. Okay, so I was going to move on to how we attract and retain talent then, because for me, this is really the starting point of sort of how we can approach inclusion in the workplace and thinking about the sorts of policies and processes that we need to have in place. The starting point really for me is about data, and this isn't about saying that data is, you know, everything and that we should all hang our hats on understanding our data, but it's certainly really important in helping us to assess our current position. So I wanted to break down perhaps some of the areas of data that we can turn to. Employee demographic data. Obviously, that feels like a good first starting point. So really looking at that composition of your people by different job levels, and then splitting it down according to gender, age, ethnicity, disability, and sexuality. But there may be some limitations here. So again, we're very dependent on the systems that we have. And I know some of the conversations I have on a regular basis with my HR team on what I can and can't measure and how I can split data down. But obviously jurisdictional requirements will also come into play here in terms of what we actually are allowed to ask as well. So working for a global organisation, that can often be quite a challenge for me in terms of really assessing the kind of demographic makeup of our organisation. But we can also use that for our recruitment data as well. And we have a big graduate recruitment process where we get sort of over 1,000 candidates applying for our jobs, which is really helpful for us to then start to see, well, you know, who is it that's applying for our jobs? How are they progressing through that recruitment process? Are there any barriers that are sort of starting to appear that we perhaps need to think about how we build assessment in slightly differently? So again, that's been really valuable for us in terms of refining our approach to recruitment. I mean, obviously the employee opinion survey is really helpful as well. So if you're an organisation that does regular temperature checks, you know, pulse surveys, annual evaluations, things like that, then it's really helpful if you can build in some questions around approach to diversity, belief in the leadership approach to diversity, how inclusive does the culture feel to people. And again, if you can try and cut the data in to include some element of voluntary responses that help you to start to see some of those opinions according to groups, and that's also really helpful as well to see where you've got any particular gaps. Talent management data. This is really, from a progression point of view, is, you know, are you starting to see any obvious barriers in your organisation to how people are moving through? So are there any kind of glass ceilings starting to appear? Are there any obvious bottlenecks in the organisation where you're starting to see the data start to shift? For us in law, we have a very obvious challenge around gender, and it's very easy for us to see where those kind of real pinch points come in the career pathway of our lawyers and how we can try and mitigate some of that. So a lot of this is numbers, and what we really want to get to is that softer stuff as well. So the qualitative data is going to be really helpful. So if you have employee resource groups, they can be an excellent source of that kind of anecdotal evidence, trying to build personal stories into things, really asking questions of them, taking your surveys perhaps, and then really drilling down through round tables and discussion groups to understand what's happening behind some of that data is really helpful. And we did a good, over the summer months through lockdown, we actually started to work really closely with our working parents. And when we first started with this, we actually realised that by just asking our mums how they were coping with things, we were missing out a whole cohort of our demographic. So by bringing the guys into the conversations, we had some really, really interesting conversations around being a working parent rather than being a working mum or a working dad. And it was at that point we realised actually the power of sort of bringing more people and hearing more voices into things and not making assumptions about who should be in that round table. Exit interview data, obviously another good point to kind of assess how people feel about the culture of the firm or the organisation. We've just recently introduced questions specifically around diversity and inclusion to really kind of get a sense as to is there anything that we need to know as people leave. Invariably, how honest people are at that point is difficult to judge, but it's still quite useful insight if anything does get raised. And then another important one for us, particularly being a global organisation, is the cultural and community norms. So it's really helpful to kind of look outside of the four walls of your organisation and just to understand what the lay of the land is. As I mentioned, being a global organisation, you know, we're very sensitive and alive to the fact that we will not make as much progress in certain areas, particularly around LGBT+ inclusion. So we have offices in the Middle East and in Asia, and it's not something that we really talk about. It's not something that we include in our sort of diversity proposition. But also equally, you have to sort of look at some of those norms as well in your local communities. And there's a great example that was given to me over the summer by a colleague who really wanted to write a blog about his move from Northern Ireland to Manchester and what a difference that had made to him in terms of how he felt more comfortable and more authentic with his identity. And clearly growing up in Northern Ireland, which was a very heavily Catholic area, he found it very difficult to be himself and encountered quite a lot of bias and prejudice and discrimination. So he made the decision to move to Manchester, and he said literally on that day one when he arrived in Manchester, he just got a sense that this community was much more welcomed, that there was a much more comfort with the LGBT+ community, and he really started to feel at home. He subsequently met his boyfriend, and who is now his fiance, and you can just see how happy and settled that he now is. So that was a really important point about recognising about some of those local nuances that we have to be mindful about. So thinking about all of these elements, it's really important that we turn our attention to this employee value proposition concept. So what is it that you are putting out to your potential candidates, and how are they viewing you as an organisation? And an employee value proposition really represents the values and the culture of your organisation and the practical benefits for employees such as learning, growth and development and opportunities. CIPD say that an effective EVP aligns the whole work experience from culture, mission and values to total rewards through jobs and people. There is a war for talent, and there's a lot of skill shortages, disruptive technologies, volatile market conditions. All of these are having a real bearing on our talent pools and availability of candidates. So it's really important that we get this bit right. We have to be very clear, very purposeful in what we're telling our candidates about who we are. And that really needs to permeate through the whole organisation. So if you were to ask any manager at any one point in time, they should all be able to articulate as closely as possible what that employee value proposition is. What does it mean to work in this organisation? So let's start with a few questions that we might want to ask ourselves and to build that. How do we characterise ourselves as an organisation? What is our mission? Why does it matter? Where will we source the employees we need to succeed? Who are our competitors for the talent we need? And who are the top talent and what matters to them? And it was on that final point that we actually did a little bit of research to ask a bit more of our LGBT talent to find out what it was that they were looking for from us to help them to make a decision as to whether we were the right employer for them. And I thought I'd share with you some of the results from that survey. So one of the things we asked them is, how are they finding this out? You know, we live in an incredibly online world now, so I was curious to see what their sources of information were. And as you can see here, actually, despite living in a very online world, it was friends and colleagues that had the most bearing on their view of inclusivity at an organisation. So by that, we're talking about potentially people that move around. Obviously in law, there's a lot more movement between law firms, so people tend to get a bit more kind of peer input. But obviously the online platforms are still very well used, so people are looking at your websites to find out about what you're doing specifically around LGBT inclusion. Social media, so what content are you putting out that helps to inform people about that value proposition? Diversity events, so I can only speak to law fairs, we do a lot of law fairs, we're heading into graduate season right now, and we're really thinking very carefully about how do we curate those events, you know, what information are we sharing, who are the people that we would put at those events to really role model the right behaviours and to demonstrate the culture of our firm. Industry press, so people are reading up about us. And then actually what was interesting is that the application and interview process was also seen as a really good opportunity to ask about inclusion, to ask about cultural things. So again, one of the things we've really taken with that is thinking about making sure that our interviewers are really up to speed with our diversity and inclusion programme so that they can talk about these things and really understand what it is that we're trying to achieve. So one of the ways that we've then taken this forward is looking at how do we make sure that we are engaging with specifically LGBT plus talent as well. So ensuring that all recruitment staff, so as I mentioned, making sure that our interviewers are up to speed, but this is also looking at identities as well and terminology, making sure that we don't misgender or use correct, and that we're using the correct pronouns as well. So making sure that we're completely up to date with all of the right terminology. And I have to say that Stonewall's glossary of terms has been absolutely invaluable to help us with that. And then also another tip is around ensuring that your recruitment and interviewing staff are also trained on trans issues in particular. So if people have gaps in their CV, it's not jumping to any assumptions about capability, but it also might be due to time taken off for transitioning, potential surgeries and things like that. We've also started thinking about how we can recruit specifically as well through sites like Stonewall, MyG Work and Proud Employers. And we've really started to engage now with specific diversity recruiters, so we know that we can connect with that audience. And I think with Stonewall, as part of your membership, you get, I think it's 5 adverts for free a year, which actually has worked out really beneficially for us. And then also perhaps another suggestion, and this tends to work more in law, and I was trying to think like work for people that are outside of law, but if you do have organisations in your network that you do work closely with, perhaps in your supplier network, maybe hosting a graduate day, you know, specifically tailored and aimed at LGBT people is another good way of trying to sort of showcase potential employers to a specific audience as well. So then we asked our LGBT plus colleagues, what is it that they look for? So what are the indicators of inclusion that would stand out for them? And this was a bit of an overview really of the list that they provided. So I won't read through all of those. I'll just let you sort of reflect on some of those and see if they're things that fit with your organisation. I think that gives us quite a broad brush of things to be working on, but it was very interesting to see the things that they're looking for. So it just helps to give us those clues as to what we could be doing more of. And it really is about that external positioning, which is a crucial part of attracting talent, but also these are the things that can obviously plug into engagement and how we retain talent as well. So considerations for promotions then. So as I say, a lot of this really is going to come back to data and looking at your data points, understanding if there are any glass ceilings, and they might be real glass ceilings. So as I've alluded to in our organisation, the gender issue is very, very live to us, but there could also be some perceived glass ceilings as well. And those issues will definitely be coming out of your listening groups and those more perhaps intimate round tables where you can get that qualitative data from people. And what's interesting, and this isn't just particular to LGBT plus people, but also minority groups in general, is that they are not as likely to put themselves forward for promotion and development opportunities. So finding ways to flag those opportunities through your networks is really helpful. And this is where things like your sponsorship can really kick in, if you have sponsorship programs, mentoring programs, and just making sure that people are switched on to opportunities within the organisation and helping people to push themselves forward to be considered. I'm getting feedback from LGBT staff that, about what they feel is potentially holding them back from putting themselves up for promotion, and what can you do to support them. So that really feeds into that second point. And then ensuring that those in charge of promotion decisions are also trained in LGBT related issues and experiences. So again, the sort of the training and the education and the awareness piece that we talked about for the interviewers and recruiters very much tracks through to those that then may be involved in evaluations and promotions as well. So I'm now going to move on to unconscious bias. And this is something that I find incredibly interesting because it gets us into that whole kind of neuroscience way of thinking. And the first thing I'll say, is that bias is an inevitability, and we probably all know that. I think that unconscious bias is something, particularly in our space, which is talked about a tremendous amount. But I wanted to look at why that is happening. And some of us may have come across Daniel Kahneman and his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And for me, this was just completely sums up why bias happens. And when you start to really understand that sort of brain science, we can give ourselves perhaps a bit of a break and to think about things differently and reframe how we then move forward. So our brain receives trillions of bits of information on a daily basis. So it has to be efficient in how it operates. Otherwise, we just wouldn't do anything. So we have this fast thinking area of our brain that gets us through the day. It makes millions of unconscious decisions that help us to, to blink, to breathe, to walk. And we learn these things obviously as we go through life. And as we get into more complex dynamic environments, that fast thinking mode can be incredibly helpful to help us to get work done. And 9 times out of 10, that fast thinking gives us a really successful outcome. We're very satisfied with the outcome we get from that. We're not walking into walls or forgetting to blink. These are all things that we're very grateful for. But unfortunately, because of this fast thinking, we are very quick to accept the version of reality that it wants us to see. And that's when bias can really kick in. It's because we see a version of that reality and we assume that it is correct. But it keeps us moving forward. We are following a tried and tested method. And as I say, if we've had successful outcomes before that haven't felt like there's been any element of failure, then almost our brains are quite lazy and thinking, well, why should I change? If this is working, why do I need to do anything to fix it? And the brain likes feeling comfortable. So what we need to think about is, how do we slow down our brains? When can we use that more kind of slower analytical pattern of thinking to help us? And that's what I want us to think about in this notion of unconscious bias. Do we, in that case, go out and do lots of training on unconscious bias? And I was also interested to see at this point, how many people actually are running unconscious bias training? Do we see this as our solution? So Grace, could I ask you to just run my second poll? How are we doing? Interesting. Okay, so we're sort of split a little bit between the uncertainty over the effectiveness of the unconscious bias training that we are currently running, and some people that are perhaps thinking about it but not doing it as yet. And interesting to see that 0% have come back with not feeling that this is a right approach for us. So I think we're still very positive about the importance of unconscious bias training, and it clearly has a place, but perhaps we're not quite sure which direction to take it in to make it as effective as we can. So what I'd like to talk about for this next part is thinking about maybe some alternatives. What are the challenges to unconscious bias? Why are we sort of sitting in this slightly kind of not sure, on the fence sort of space? So the problem with unconscious bias training, and how do we mitigate some of these problems? So research suggests that unconscious bias training is really effective at raising awareness. But unfortunately, research has shown us that there is little correlation between raising awareness and an actual decrease in bias. So the training is great in that moment for people to sit and reflect, and to maybe give themselves a little bit of a, you know, that their internal voice starts to think, okay, yep, that could be me, so I definitely need to do something about that. But then we get back into our day jobs. Don't forget, our brains, our fast-thinking brains, are getting us back on track to getting us through our day. So we are unlikely to go back to our desks and change anything, particularly a week, 2 weeks, 6 months later. So what do? Well, we can do it more regularly. So instead of doing a large chunk of training around unconscious bias, a one-off, maybe annual mandatory piece of training, it's actually about trying to make it more bite-sized, giving reminders at important decision-making stages, such as hiring and promoting, about some of the key biases to look out for. So it could be that you just embed it into some of your materials, you know, helpful hints, helpful reminders, rather than trying to deliver it as a one-off training scheme. We make excuses for ourselves. You know, as people, we don't like to think of ourselves as nasty or mean. So we can sometimes sort of devalue this in our own minds, because, you know, our brain is trying to tell us that we're good people effectively, and we couldn't possibly do these bad things. And often this word unconscious can create an environment of excuse, because we'll be thinking, well, you know, if it's unconscious, there's nothing I can do about that. That's just the way it is. So we need to try and break that sort of cycle. And one way to do that is really helping people to accept that biases do affect them. So it's trying to take away that sort of blame and guilt feelings, but just to say that, you know, this is part of who we are, and to understand the brain science as to why it happens. And then to connect people with the outcomes of their bias. So again, you know, our brains are telling us we don't want to be bad people. So helping us to find ways that we can mitigate some of these biases, and using things like personal stories to be a bit more explicit about some of the direct impacts that bias can have on people, will certainly make us think a bit differently about slowing down our thinking, and really analysing those areas that we think we do have a bias in, and how we might be able to do things differently. So people are concerned about the impact, the negative impact that this can have. And then there are many types of biases. So how can you possibly train everyone in all of them in one training session? So this is a real challenge, and that's why, you know, thinking about those key points where bias might creep in is potentially a more effective way than trying to cover them all as a sort of a blanket approach. So showing people how to replace those tendencies with ones that more closely match their values can also be more powerful as well, because again, it connects to that authentic person that you are, and think, well, I don't want to be that person, I don't want to be seen as that person, and actually promoting or hiring a more diverse candidate pool is really important to me. So let me understand what it is that's in myself that's stopping me from doing that, and coming up with a personal action plan that can help me. So again, these things may be better tackled on a smaller scale rather than trying to do it across the whole organisation. But there are some alternatives as well to this sort of traditional notion of unconscious bias training. And I think a lot of people have got quite tired with the terminology. So there are some ways to just change the focus on this and to reframe it slightly. And one of the things that we've tried is talking about conscious inclusion. So it's the same thing, but it's got a different label, and it sounds a bit more interesting to people. They think it's something new, and they're actually plugging into it a lot more. And we've used this quite successfully at a graduate level. I can't confess that we've rolled this out any wider, but certainly in that kind of graduate space where we have a really good structured program we found that by talking to people about some of our inclusion strategies, has really started helping them think about how they as individuals can be more conscious in the way that they conduct themselves through the recruitment process, how they act as interviewers to be consciously inclusive. So that was one approach that I thought I would share with you. Another one is bystander or upstander training. And this is something which has gathered quite a bit of momentum recently. And it's based on the premise that we are all allies and we're all working to solve the same problems. It's inviting colleagues and employees and people generally to shape the culture, to shape the environment of the organisation that they're in by not allowing bad behaviours to take hold. So it's almost like an intervention type programme rather than a training programme. It's helping people to feel empowered to speak up if they see something happening which they think is incongruent to the wider values of the organisation. It's often known as kind of preventing that gateway behaviour. So it's taking something which is quite small, calling it out and then stopping it from evolving into something that can be more dangerous. And there's a really interesting link with this notion and well-being, which is another angle which is quite interesting to play on, because well-being is obviously something which is massively talked about at the moment, and it's this connection with microaggressions. And I was inspired recently at a talk I went to where Binna Condola was speaking from the company Pern Condola, which is a specialist D&I trainer. And he talked about what he actually calls micro-incivilities, which is microaggressions. And he expressed it as being this: the kinds of daily commonplace behaviours or aspects of an environment which signal, wittingly or unwittingly, to members of outgroups that they do not belong and are not welcome. And I thought that this was another interesting take on how we can create training around unconscious bias, which is new and takes it into a different angle. So what I want to do is just quickly walk you through what we mean by some of this. So examples of microaggressions then can be, the word micro is obviously very key here. So these are things that can happen in an everyday situation. So we have verbal things. So it's things that you say, interrupting people, cutting people short when they're in mid-flow, giving people less time in a meeting to perhaps speak out and share their views. And then that constant criticism, so constantly picking away at somebody. Then you have the non-verbal, which is in your body language. And there's a big one here around eye contact. And this is where you create a difficult scenario, because by denying someone eye contact, it actually is signifying to that person that, that they don't belong, because you're not crediting them with significant enough connection for them to be part of your social group. It's a very powerful psychological thing through eye contact that we can do. And then there's cognitive elements as well. So we've probably been in those meetings where someone's come up with an idea and they haven't really been heard, and then someone else comes up with the same idea and everyone jumps on it and thinks it's wonderful. So it's this notion that for some people, particularly minority groups, their ideas are less likely to be thought of as successful and often get attributed to somebody else. So these are all examples that Binna shared with us on microaggressions. And what was really interesting about how we articulated this was looking at the power that this can have on people from a well-being perspective. And it was found that, I'm going to have to read from my notes here, it was found that in a recent study, they did a study of 300,000 individuals looking into the power of social connections. And they found that the quality of social relationships was a better indicator of mortality than smoking, alcohol consumption, and high blood pressure. So these are what we call social exchanges, and the power of positive social exchanges were actually found to protect against conditions such as cardiovascular disease, and it's actually been referred to as a social cure. So being more mindful and being more consciously present in how we work with people, and some of these verbal, non-verbal and cognitive microaggressions that might slip out are a really eloquent way, I think, of kind of bringing unconscious bias into a slightly different dynamic. As part of that is the notion of allyship. And I wanted to share with you a video that we launched within the firm. Now, I won't promise to say that this is the best video that you'll ever see, but it sort of starts to highlight for you like how important we feel that allyship is here. And allyship is a really, again, another useful way to start thinking about how you tackle unconscious bias. And by bringing people into the community so that they understand, that they're aware of the issues, is really important. So we put a statement out to say that being an ally to the LGBTQ+ community is a great way to show kindness, support, and to create safe spaces for LGBTQ+ people. In a world where everything has slowed to all but a stop, why not give your time to those who need it? Whether gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, or ally, reach out to someone you know who might be isolated and in need of support. So this is really underpinning this notion of speaking out, and if that person feels uncomfortable doing it themselves, really being that ally, being that bystander, being that upstander that can step in and try and change the course of that behaviour. Okay, so I'll hand over to David now, and he can talk about the policy side of things. So David, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm not going to try and put any videos together because I honestly don't think my tech skills are up to it. And who wants to see a video on a diversity policy anyway? It's probably not going to be riveting. So the first question I thought I'd ask you is, who here actually has an equality and diversity policy within their company? And Grace is going to put a poll out for us. Thank you. Grace, if you just want to put up the answers that we've got for now. Thank you. Okay, so a good mix. So my next question was going to be, who knows where it is, which, looking at the 53% of you who say you're not sure where people find it, do you know where it is? Okay, that is positive. This is a good start. Who's read it recently? See, this is much better, because if we were all in a room, you'd all have to put your hands up or leave your hands down, and then those of you that haven't read it would be embarrassed. And, you know, it's one of those things. It's completely anonymous. It's perfect for everyone. Okay, 2/3. And then the final question, is it published publicly? Okay, so my takeaways from that are that, similarly to us at Squires, everyone on this call is on a bit of a journey, which I guess makes sense, because otherwise why would you be here, right? So looking at an effective and compliant diversity policy, I think the first things that we should look at, particularly because this is looking at how to make it compliant with the Equality Act, is what does the Equality Act cover? Now, I am not going to try and cover the entire Equality Act in the next however long I speak for, because it would probably take me all day and I'd miss something out, because it's a massive piece of legislation. But the basics are that there are a number of protected characteristics within the Equality Act, and then there are different types of discrimination which give rise to certain claims. So first of all, I'm just going to summarise the protected characteristics for you, and also include some watch outs. Wendy is kindly performing the role of slide assistant for me, so thank you, Wendy. So there on the left, you've got the different protected characteristics. I'll let you read them. You're probably all aware of them anyway. There's no point in my going through them. But then on the right-hand side, I'll pull out some of the watch outs that we've referred to. So obviously, in relevant to this discussion, sex, it's broader than just male-female, which is right, but hasn't always been that way, and sometimes people get caught out by that. Marriage and civil partnership, again, sometimes people get caught out by the civil partnership part of that. They shouldn't be, but they can be. Sexual orientation, again, you don't have to be public about your orientation to bring a claim. There is also sometimes a claim about the perception or belief of someone's orientation as well, rather than a genuine knowledge about the orientation. And then finally, gender reassignment. Again, protection starts from the moment someone tells you they're considering this. It isn't, and quite rightly, again, it doesn't have to be someone takes a definite step to say, I want to, I am undergoing gender reassignment, I've been to see my doctor, I've taken XYZ steps. It's from the moment they say, I'm considering this, they are protected, which is entirely fair, because otherwise you'd have a class of people who are completely unprotected by the law, who could be discriminated against with impunity. So when we talk about discrimination, the Daily Mail loves to throw around, so-and-so got £3 million for discrimination. What does that mean? Because there is no actual claim of discrimination. And we'll now look at what the different types of discrimination are seamlessly.
David, I'm having the usual challenge. Just
we did it this way to stop us having to flip the slides between us on the call, and it worked perfectly well when we were doing it previously. But as ever, technology fails at the most important moment.
Right, everyone, bear with.
So the main types are indirect, so direct, indirect discrimination. So two different types of discrimination. And again, they're set out on the screen. It's pretty obvious what direct discrimination is. You treat someone less favourably because of their protected characteristic. Indirect discrimination is the one that's more commonly applied because it's much broader. You don't have to intend to discriminate against someone, but you end up discriminating against them because of the way you apply a provision, criterion, or practice. The one that we refer to here is require all staff to work full time. Well, actually that discriminates against working parents and particularly historically working mothers, but not necessarily so now. So that can justify a indirect discrimination claim. Harassment is the other one that you see a lot of. That is where there is an intimidating, hostile, or humiliating environment for a person, and that relates to a protected characteristic of that person. And it doesn't matter what someone's intention is. You quite often hear in the office space, oh, it was just a bit of banter. Yeah, it was just a comment between two mates. We didn't know they were going to overhear it. Well, that doesn't really matter, because it's the effect it has upon the individual who hears it or who sees it that is important for harassment. The next one is victimization, which is over the page. And victimization is where someone is treated less favorably because they allege that someone has committed an act of discrimination. So you raise a grievance, you raise the complaint under the Equal Opportunities Policy. You say, for example, I think my manager's failed to promote me because of my orientation, you raise some of the microaggressions that Wendy has seen previously and say, I've not been put on the same high profile accounts, I've not had the same opportunities, etc., etc. That complaint is raised with the manager. The manager then decides to treat you even more harshly because you've raised the complaint. That would be victimization. I'm not going to go into reasonable adjustments because that's not relevant to this area, that's relevant for disability at all. I just didn't want to leave you missing one of them when I was giving you the explanation. And then the final one to mention is positive action. Positive action is a power that's contained within the Equality Act to allow employers to introduce measures which are designed to help certain sectors of the workforce, particularly those with protected characteristics, overcome a disadvantage. And it's to meet specific needs, encourage participation. And the key one where we tend to see this is in recruitment or promotion. So if you have two people who are completely the same level when you're recruiting them in terms of they've scored the same in interview, etc., you are allowed to choose one with a protected characteristic over someone who doesn't share that characteristic if your aim is to increase the number of employees within your industry or your business who are underrepresented. So you see it a lot with women in STEM, you also see it quite a lot with minorities. You see it less in the LGBT plus sphere, and I think some of that is still to do with perhaps a fear of people being open about their orientation and the impact that it might have on them. But again, that's why you have the allyship and all some of the other matters that Wendy's been speaking about. So claims can be brought pre-employment, during employment, on termination, or post-employment, and pre-employment, it's things like job adverts. Interestingly, pre-recruitment investigations. So something we started to see a lot of is most people have a LinkedIn page. Lots of people have a Facebook page, although people have rowed back from that as there's a genuine sort of a concern about Facebook's intentions. In those circumstances, your recruitment or HR teams might have a dig around online and say, "Oh, what's someone's social history? Let's have a look." Well, by doing that, you may well find out. You may well then be on notice of their orientation, which you wouldn't normally be. You wouldn't ask someone in an interview, what's your orientation? So you need to be aware of that. If you're going to carry out those investigations, we would say generally don't. And then obviously you can't discriminate during employment, you can't discriminate when deciding who to terminate, and you can't discriminate when giving a reference. So far, so straightforward. Who can be liable? So who pays? Well, claims can be brought again by potential current or past employees, and that isn't just people who are employed by you, it's a broader definition, so it's anyone really who works for you, falls within the Equality Act. And the claims can be made against the company, or, and quite rightly, they can also be made against the individuals who have carried out the discrimination. And that still comes as a shock to a lot of people, but it's one of the things which I think for line managers in particular, and we'll talk about line manager training in a bit, if they understand that actually they could be on the hook for this, not only are they potentially going to lose a valued and talented employee if they do not apply the equality and diversity policy in the right way, but actually they could be liable themselves, then that quite often is a nice hook to bring them on side. And then the remedy is a declaration. Well, the declaration is just a court saying you've been discriminated against. It's a nice piece of paper to have, but the hammer is the compensation, really, which is uncapped. And that's where you see the Daily Mail saying £3 million, because it will be a banker who's been discriminated against because of their gender. Their bonuses were £1 million a year. They've been out of work for 3 years. There you go. That's your £3 million. And then the other one is that a court can and will make a recommendation to an employer take steps to reduce the effect of the discrimination. And they're common where there's an institutional issue that needs to be considered. If it's an individual case, then most of the time, by the time it gets to tribunal, those have been dealt with. So that is a very whistle-stop tour of the Equality Act. Probably most of it was not new to you at all, but just in case it was, I had to go through it. So how do you make a diversity policy Equality Act compliant? It's a trick question. There is no requirement under the Equality Act to have an equality and diversity policy, none whatsoever. The only obligations are to comply with equal pay legislation, not discriminate against applicants or staff. Again, note staff is broader than just employees, it's employees, workers, and do all they reasonably can to prevent discrimination and harassment by others. Now, do all you reasonably can is one of those delightfully legal phrases, isn't it? You know, who knows what it means, and it's in the eye of the beholder in every single case. But having a equality and diversity policy can be a really part of showing you've done all you reasonably can. It's called a reasonable steps defence, and the employer basically says, look, we get that you may have been discriminated against in this case, but we didn't know about it, and when you raised a grievance with us, then we dealt with it, hopefully. But we also did all we could to try and stop you being discriminated against, and that's fine. And they'll quite often pull out their equal opportunities policy and go, here you go, here is our 70-page equal opportunities policy. Yeah, aren't we brilliant? And that works really well until the judge says, oh, is your HR director here and giving evidence? Fantastic. So when was this put in place? Right, 2010, just after the Equality Act. Good. When was it updated? Oh, so it's not been updated. Okay. And how often are line managers trained on this? Right, they're not. And when are staff trained on it? Okay, they're not. So it's good to have a policy, but if you want to have that protection under the Equality Act, it needs to be a living document. You need to keep it under review, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And you need to train people as well. And there's the Equality and Human Rights Commission has a code of practice. I thought I'll print it off and then I can show it to you so you can see it. And I realized it was about 350 pages, and I'm using my wife's printer because I'm working from home, so I don't want to use all of her ink. But if you go on the Equality and Human Rights Commission website, there is a link to their code of practice, and section 18 talks about equality policies. And there it says there's no statutory requirement to have an equality policy. Good, we know that. But you need to have a systemic approach to developing and maintaining good practice. Because if you do that, that's your way of showing that you take your legal obligations seriously. So we've talked about what should go in a diversity policy. It's really a matter for each employer. It's a cultural thing. And you need to write it in a way that fits your business. If you're public sector, you've got potentially additional duties on you as well, and you need to be clear about those. If you're private sector, then it can be as short or as long as you like. I think there are a few watch outs. Make sure it's updated is a key one, but also make sure you list all the relevant protected characteristics if you're going to list them. I've lost count of the number of policies that I've seen, and it'll say, oh, there are 5 protected characteristics. You think, no, there aren't. There's definitely more than that. And the problem is, if you don't list them all and it's not correct, then you're automatically sending a negative message, not only to the employees who share the missing protected characteristics, but also to the rest of your staff, because you're demonstrating that really this is just a piece of paper, and it's nothing that you stand behind. Because if you stand behind it, you'll review it and update it. Explain the types of conduct in simple language, not in legal terms. It doesn't need to read the way the slides do earlier, but in ways that people can understand, so that employees know where the bright lines are. You must not cross this line. It shouldn't be a grievance policy. We will talk about them briefly afterwards, but as I said, it's a statement of your culture, aims and objectives, and Wendy talked a lot about how the importance of culturing this as well. Don't make it legal. Choose inclusive, supportive language. Signpost where employees can turn to for help. That might be HR, it might be allies, it might be the employee assistance program. It's it's really up to you as a business what different levels of support you offer, but you need to tell employees where to turn to if they think there is an issue under the diversity policy. And the other thing, and it goes back to the same point as the as listing all the protected characteristics. If you list one, list them all. If you're going to use terminology, use it properly and use it inclusively. Because again, there is nothing which will send a negative message more quickly than using the wrong terminology or using inappropriate terminology. So do it, but there's plenty of good examples online. As Wendy said, we've engaged with Stonewall and lots of other providers. That there are people who will help you with this. Don't feel you need to do it on your own. So I talked about the HRC code. This has some other suggestions as to what policies should include. So, statement of commitment to equal opportunity for all job applicants and workers. That's really important because these used to be called equal opportunities policies, and yes, it's now about diversity and inclusion, but at its heart, it's about saying all opportunities should be open to everyone. We've talked about what is and isn't acceptable behaviour. I think, again, we also need to flag conduct around the workplace can be work related. And there's plenty of case law that says if you go to the pub with your mates after work, and that's a regular Friday night drinks organised by the team, that might not be a social event, that could still be a work event. And again, anything that happens there could well be the responsibility of the employer. So think about those when you're drafting your policy, or for those of you that have them, when you're updating them. Rights and responsibilities under the policy, there will be different levels for different people, so employees, managers, HR, etc. Procedures for dealing with concerns and complaints. Do you want that to automatically be a grievance, or do you want people to raise that more informally with HR? And also how it applies to other policies and procedures. So we talked about monitoring and reviewing constantly. It's not just this policy that you need to constantly review. There will be family-friendly policies, recruitment policies, retirement policies, health and safety, employee assistance. All of these things will impact your equal opportunities policy and will be impacted by it. So you need to audit those at the same time that you're auditing your equal opportunities. Your diverse, now I'm calling equal opportunities, showing my age, your diversity policy. There's a few other recommendations in the Equality and Human Rights Commission Code of Practice. So how you will deal with breaches. Again, it will depend upon the severity of the breach, but it may include disciplinary action. Clearly, if someone is wandering around the office harassing staff, there needs to be an investigation, there needs to be a disciplinary, potentially. Who is responsible for the policy? That's always a good thing to have, because ultimately the buck stops with someone. It might be a D&I lead, it might be an HR director, it might be someone on the board. But ultimately, someone is responsible for the final draft of that policy. And ideally, their name will be on there, although they may not always want their name to be on there, depending on what shape it's in. How the policy will be implemented, and then the final one that I'm going to mention is details of monitoring and review. So how often you monitor and review it. And there, I think it's important to keep track of changes. So have an update list at the bottom, say updated to version 1.1, 2.0, whatever, and the date. That helps in a host of different ways, not least because it helps you keep track of potentially historic issues. So if an employee comes back to you with a list of complaints ranging over 3 years, you can easily show what the diversity policy covered at each stage. And that may well be very important. And also you can show the updates that you've put in place. And again, that may well be very, very important in any subsequent claim. Finally, employment tribunals are required to take the code of practice into account in any discrimination claim. So there's a reason all these recommendations are there in paragraph 18. It's worth a read. it is a big document, but if you just, for this purpose, if you just read paragraph 18, it will provide you with quite a lot of useful information. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through effective procedures for cases of harassment or grievance, because it's even more dry, if I'm honest. But I have been asked to talk about it, so I will do so, and I will make it as interesting as I can, and then you can ask, once Wendy's covered the final piece, you can ask us any questions. So the starting point is there's an ACAS code of practice on disciplinaries and grievances. Always worth starting there, for the very simple reason that if you do not comply with the ACAS code of practice and you end up in a tribunal may well increase the award payable to an employee by up to 25%. So always start with the ACAS code of practice. The second most important thing for me in a grievance procedure is do not make it contractual. Now, for some of you who are unionised, you may not have a choice. You may have collectively bargained grievance procedures, and if you do, then I commiserate with you, because if you breach the grievance procedure, then technically it's a breach of contract, and you have all the bad things that flow from a breach of contract coming out of it. Now, it's not the end of the world if they're contractual, but try to keep them non-contractual, not least for the reason that it allows you to change them and vary them as you need. Consider your culture, your values, and your resources. So culture, do you want people to immediately issue a grievance and this become effectively, a grievance is mini litigation within the workplace? Is that always the best thing to do? It can be, but it's not always necessary. Sometimes it's much better to have an informal step first of all. And I've lost count of the number of times that someone's put a letter in that the client sent it to us and said, oh, we've got this, is this a grievance? Well, it is, but look at it. Do you really need to go off and investigate? Or could you just say, look, we'd like to sit the two of you down in a room together and try and mediate this first of all? People may not agree, but often a process of mediation, particularly facilitated by a properly trained mediator, is much more effective than a grievance investigation with lots of people being asked questions around the business, egos being bruised, and people falling out and the relationship being damaged. Whereas a mediator will help both sides to see each other's point of view, hopefully, not always. So again, does everything need to go to a grievance? Think of your resources, particularly if you're being pressed to proffer timeframes in a grievance process. If you've got a very limited lean HR team, how quickly can you respond to stuff? Don't agree to deadlines if you can avoid it, but if you can, make them fit your resources. So avoid what I'd call hard lines. The main one is, oh, the appeal will always be to someone a level up from the hearing manager. Well, that might not always be possible. Again, you've got to think about your resources and your staffing. Consider whether confidentiality is possible before making promises. This is a big one. Quite often an employer will say, I want to raise a grievance, but I want it kept completely confidential. Well, how do you investigate a grievance if the employee won't let you talk about the subject of the grievance? Equally, if you speak to a potential witness and they say, I'll tell you this, but I'm not letting you use my name. Well, again, how can you use that information, particularly if by doing so you'd identify the employee who's heard by the witness without using their name? So always consider if you can actually keep something confidential before giving that promise. Be flexible. Don't say, oh, well, we told you had to raise a grievance within X number of days and you did it in X+5, therefore we're not accepting it. I mean, the purpose of a grievance policy is raise your legitimate concerns. It doesn't mean you have to accept everything. It doesn't mean that you can't push back on employees in appropriate cases, but you want to hear employees' concerns. So apply the policy flexibly and ensure there's a right of appeal. The ACAS code tells you to have a right of appeal. I've seen lots of policies that don't have a right of appeal, but do have a right of appeal. So, and then just a few tips on how to handle a grievance, because what's the point of telling you how to write a policy without telling you how to handle one if you get one, right? So prepare. Before you meet with the employee, try and understand in your mind what the key headings of their grievance are. So if it's overheard conversations between staff in the print room, if it's rude cards being left on my desk, if it's people watching videos that I don't appreciate the desk over from me, put them into the different buckets and try and group everything under each bucket. But know what you believe the issues are, clarify them with the employee, plan who you need to speak to, not necessarily who you might want to speak to, because again, you don't want to start investigating with 20 people around the office, because that will just raise whispers, and that'll just make things worse. But plan. Do be aware of your policies and procedures, try and follow them, try and comply with any timescales that you have. But if you can't, tell the employee as early as possible. If you can't, I had one where an employee raised a whole host of orientation, discrimination complaints against a lot of other employees, and the timescale in the employer's policy was, we'll meet with you within 5 working days and we'll then give you a decision 5 working days after the meeting. And the grievance letter itself was 30 pages long. So we just went back and said, look, I know it says 5 working days, but it's going to take us 10 days to at least understand your grievance, and then we've got to interview people. So can we agree on a month? And the employer said, look, absolutely fine, I want you to do a good job. And then make sure the investigator is aware of the ACAS Code of Practice and the ACAS Investigations Guide, because again, it just covers you in the event of any future issues. I talked about bucketing the different allegations, so put them into different groups. That's really helpful, because it's if you get a detailed grievance, naturally you want to respond on every point and say, I uphold this, I don't uphold this, I agree this happened, I don't agree this happened, etc. But sometimes you get sucked into unnecessary details that way. Deal with all the allegations, so all the heads of allegation, but you don't necessarily need to deal with every single incident alleged. Do, however, make the same inquiry into each party's position. So if you're making inquiries, or when you've spoken to the employee who's raised the grievance, try to make the same level of inquiry of the witnesses and the people who the complaints have been raised about, because they need a chance to defend themselves too. A really key one is this isn't law and order. This isn't a criminal trial. You don't have to reach a decision beyond reasonable doubt. It's simply, more likely than not, did something happen? And it's worth saying as well, look, even if I've decided it's more likely than not this happened, that's purely based on the evidence I've seen. I'm not saying you're lying. It's just, it seems more likely to me that the scales tip in one way rather than the other. Don't turn it into a disciplinary process. There may well be a recommendation of a disciplinary outcome out of this, but this isn't a disciplinary, it's a grievance. Do confirm the decision in writing and the reasons, obviously, and again, allow a right of appeal. I know I keep stressing it, it's because we often don't see it. Then the final slide is, what are the common pitfalls? People miss grievances. They don't have to be in a letter with bold writing saying, I'm raising a grievance. So any complaint in writing is technically a grievance, and your policies may even allow verbal grievances. So be alive to that, make sure your managers are alive to that. You haven't followed policies and procedures. It's not fatal, but it will lead to easy questions for the other side if you end up in tribunal as to why did you not follow your own policies and procedures. The next two are really taken together, but often lots of complaints of discrimination, particularly around orientation, are in that category that some people try and pass it off as office banter, or just boys being boys, or something like that. And it's very easy for a business to not take those seriously, and also to not understand the hurt that comments make to an individual. And it comes back to that point about harassment. It's not what it looks like on the outside to you. It's not whether that comment to you seems reasonable. It's how did it make that person feel? There is, of course, an element of that spectrum which says, if someone is so sensitive that no reasonable person would have been hurt by that comment, then yes, that's not going to be harassment. But in general, you have to try and understand how the person raising the grievance felt. Your line manager shouldn't be looking at it going, geez, they've been so sensitive. Really, this isn't a grievance material. That's somewhere that employers often come unstuck. Inadequate investigations, you get the grievance, you look at it, you go, oh, this is nothing, and you just rubber stamp a letter without really speaking to people or taking notes. And then finally, and this is more of a cultural thing, if you force an employee into a formal grievance when they don't really want to, or even down an informal route when they feel strongly about it, all you're doing is damaging the relationship with the employee and making them feel that they're not being listened to. And they've probably raised the grievance in the first place because they feel they're not being listened to. So that is it for me. If anyone has any questions on the legal stuff, then ask us at the end, but Wendy has a final section to run through for you.
Thank you, David. That's great. And I think just picking up on relating it back to some of the issues around microaggressions, it's really interesting that point you said about, not dismissing how people feel about things, because microaggressions can be very difficult for someone to articulate. It's very hard to say, I feel like I've been biased against because someone didn't make eye contact with me in a meeting. It's where do you go with that? So I think it is that's treating that person as an individual and being sort of understanding of how things have impacted them. So I'll very quickly cover remote working. I don't want to spend too much time on this, and what I wanted to do very quickly was to think about the impact that lockdown has particularly had on the LGBT+ community. And this was another sort of blog piece that we did actually as part of our celebration of Pride Month this year. And it was really interesting to look at some of the mental health challenges that we are very alive to. We know that post-COVID, we are heading into some mental health challenges. But particularly for this community, a report by Stonewall LGBT in Britain Home and Communities report said that LGBTQ+ individuals are more susceptible to poor mental health, anxiety and depression due to discrimination and inequalities. And the impact that isolation has had is expected to be more than for a cis heterosexual counterpart. The impact of furloughing, redundancies and reliance on potentially unsupportive and unaccepting families is a reality as well. The increase of people perhaps having to live in hostile or abusive environments was demonstrated by an increase in the amount of support that was looked for around domestic abuse and violence. And then there's the impact of faith communities as well. And so people are perhaps not able to live their authentic lives because of lockdown. And this is clearly then going to have a knock-on effect as we come out of lockdown or potentially head into another one. These are all considerations we have to think about. So we've been looking at how we can provide counselling services. We've been very sort of big on the wellbeing agenda over the last few months. We've been signposting our employee assistance programme and just making sure that people can find those sources of support and help if they need them. But on a positive note, it's really some of the stuff that's come out of working from home has been great in terms of thinking about how we can be more agile in how we approach our work. And I wanted to share with you as a final thought really was around the Mindful Business Charter, which is something that we signed up to as a firm. And again, confession, this isn't something we've embedded across the firm, but we're starting to bring it into sort of local teams and particularly actually in David's practice area. And I thought this was a nice thing to end on because actually it fits so nicely with the way that the world is going. We may well be moving into this hybrid environment where you might have some people in the office and some people working from home. And that is going to create a question mark for how inclusive that we can be. So there are 4 key pillars to the Mindful Business Charter that fit very nicely with this. Openness and respect. So how do we build trust amongst each other and how do we use communication really effectively in order to do that? Smart meetings and emails. So how do we follow good guidance around meetings? And this is going to become particularly important in this hybrid environment to make sure that everyone has equal contribution to a meeting, regardless of whether they are in front of you or on a phone or struggling with their Zoom technology. Respecting rest periods. So again, consideration given to the need to switch off. And we've all probably experienced an elongation of our working days because we've been working from home and not had a commute. This really plays into the future in terms of understanding what that individual needs in order to be able to work effectively. And if they've been working David will relate to this. I know, if you've been working 10 days straight doing 12, 14-hour days, it's really respecting that requirement for downtime that person may well then need. But similarly, this is linked to individual need as well. And if someone is going through something, whether it be a mental health crisis or through any kind of physical medical need, then it's respecting that requirement for rest periods as well. And then finally, that mindful delegation piece. So really thinking very mindfully with your slow thinking brain, not your fast thinking brain, about how you are delegating work. How fair are you being? How inclusive are you being in bringing people into your projects, assigning responsibilities and delegating work out amongst the team? So a quick wrap up then of our final reflections. I would like to just take us right back to the start and really think about what your starting point is. Think about that maturity model. Where are you? Where are you trying to get to? And what are going to be the indicators of success for you? Look at your data, identify those pinch points. Remember, you can't do everything in one go. So kind of think about setting yourself some milestones and be realistic in terms of what you can do. When I came into this job, I was full of energy and enthusiasm, which I still have, but I've also really realised that this is a slow ship to turn, and you have to engage so many stakeholders that you can't change the world in a day. So talk to the experts, people like Stonewall. I feel like I've been a bit of an ambassador for Stonewall today, but they have been so helpful with our journey on LGBT+ inclusion. They've been so helpful on policies, and they've given us some great guidance. They've helped us with our resource groups, and ENEI as well have also been absolutely fantastic in guiding us. And of course, your lawyer, I could not mention that. Policies are important to protect all parties and remove ambiguity, but it's about making them accessible. So the point that David made around training and how publicly available are your policies is really important, so that people know where to go to if they need to raise an issue. And then this whole concept of slow thinking. It's a fascinating book. It's quite, it's a book and you've got to commit to it, but it's a really interesting philosophy. And I would definitely encourage you to bring that into any training that you're doing around unconscious bias, to help people to understand what this is all about, so that it removes that feeling of blame and guilt from the process. Okay, so thank you very much. I know that we are probably right up against it time-wise. A couple of questions I think did come into the chat, which I'm very happy to answer directly back. So Grace, I'll hand over to you in terms of what you think is best.
Sure. Yes, we'll answer those two questions. We'll go into the break and then we'll start back at 12:30. Okay.
Yeah. Are you okay for me to just handle that?
Adrian will ask the question.
Oh, okay, Adrian, thank you.
No worries. No, I see them here. So one particular question has been regarding the traditional unconscious bias training. We mentioned there are alternatives. Have you used external trainees, or how have you got that information?
Yeah, a bit of a mix actually. So the conscious inclusion training I mentioned is something we've done in-house, and that's been quite easy to kind of navigate because it's very much about us and our processes. I'd say for other things, particularly around the bystander training, microaggressions and what have you, that has been, it's been useful to engage with external trainers on that, and Per and Candola have been really helpful in guiding us through some of that content. So they're the ones that I'm personally aware of, if that's helpful.
Lovely. And David's made a couple of very good points here, and it's one that I remember recognising from last time I heard him speak, because I didn't realise that people that are affected by autism particularly don't like eye contact. Now, something I didn't know until David raised it at a previous conference. So when I saw that come up, I knew he was going to raise it again. It's quite a key point and something for everyone just to be aware of. And it's good that David is sharing that information with us. I think it's quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it comes back to the individual, doesn't it? And respecting the individual requirement.
Absolutely. And obviously terminology is one of those key things that changes all the time as well. Trying to keep everything updated can be quite tricky. And the Equality Act that we actually saw, some of its terminology is actually is now outdated because we've updated the words around trans and transgender particularly. So we're always on the learning curve to make sure we're right up to date with things. So just to be aware of some of that older terminology is actually still in the Act, but actually in sort of best practice currently thought at the moment, using transgender and trans as a wording is probably better than transsexual. So we just as a point going on, but I understand why it was used on the slide. So I'm conscious that we're coming up to our break. So first of all, I'd like to thank Wendy and David for an excellent presentation.